Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence program series brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs here at Johns Hopkins University. Today's event features Dr. Chris Merritt on intelligence in the South China Sea, the importance of maritime domain awareness. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Dr. Michael Ard.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone to our program today. With us, we have Dr. Christoper Merritt, who's an associate professor of intelligence studies at American Military University. And he comes to us with a lot of strong knowledge on this topic of maritime domain awareness in the South China Sea. He has led efforts to produce in-depth operational and analytic products to support maritime law enforcement investigations and policy on matters ranging from terrorism to piracy to sanctions violations and illegal fishing. His analytic tours include the U.S. Coast Guard Intelligence Coordination Center, the Office of Naval Intelligence, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Joint Intelligence Center Pacific, and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He's also served as in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for the Ministry of Defense Advisor, the U.S. mission to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, where he helped develop and promote multilateral MoDA capacity building programs in the region. Dr. Merritt holds an undergraduate degree and a master's in business administration from Hawaii Pacific University and a doctorate in education leadership from the University of Southern California. Chris, thank you very much for being with us today.
Great. Thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure. Now that I'm retired a bit, it's an opportunity for people to listen a little bit to what I have to say, and I really appreciate this opportunity from Johns Hopkins to come in and talk about the South China Sea, something I know a little bit about. So if we can, please begin the slides. So again, my name is Chris Merritt. I am retired from the Department of Defense, Department of Navy specifically, where I served as an analyst. And now I do teach full-time at American Military University. And the topic of today's presentation, obviously, will be intel in the South China Sea and the importance of maritime domain awareness. Next slide, please. This will be about a 20-minute discussion for me kind of explaining some background on the region and the role of intelligence. We'll start out with the geography. I'll go into the economics of the region, discuss a bit about maritime boundaries and their significance. We'll talk about China briefly and the PRC footprint in the South China Sea. And we will also talk about ASEAN and the role that ASEAN plays in the South China Sea. From there, I will focus on intel and MDA and discuss some of the emerging trends. Before I get started here, and for context, you'll see in this image, this is kind of made it around the internet for a while. It's a depiction of Chinese fishing vessels leaving to go out into to the South China Sea annually. And as we get through the presentation, you'll get a better sense of just how much activity occurs in the South China Sea, particularly from fishing. Next slide, please. So to provide some background, the South China Sea is geographically the maritime link between the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. The littoral states bordering the South China Sea include China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, many of whom have unresolved territorial claims for the islands and maritime features that have both economic and military significance. You'll note here at the bottom of the slide, I offered a quote from Kaplan, which I think provides a good contrast between Europe and Southeast Asia, when Kaplan states that Europe is a landscape and East Asia is a seascape. And therein lies the crucial difference between the 20th and 21st centuries. Next slide, please. So for context, I want to offer a few additional data points. It is estimated that more than half of the world's fishing vessels operate in the South China Sea, supporting an industry that employs 3.7 million people and generates $100 billion annually, accounting for 12% of global fish catch in 2015. The South China Sea is overfished at an industrial scale, with fish stocks declining an estimated 70 to 95% since the 1950s, and catch rates further declining by 66 to 75% since 2000. These factors, coupled with the impact of climate change, could lead to a complete collapse of major fish stocks in the South China Sea within our lifetime, creating a devastating food crisis in Southeast Asia. I would like to kind of focus on this image real quick. This is nighttime imagery, basically for the entire year, 365 days of 2017. A snapshot was taken of the ocean, and you can see the lights that were emitting. Now, these are not all fishing vessels. Some of these are commercial vessels. Some of these are offshore oil platforms. Any light that is being emitted was captured here. But look at how much activity occurs in the South China Sea versus the Indian Ocean region or the Pacific. This should give you an idea of just how much activity occurs in the South China Sea. Next slide, please. I broadened this out a bit more, the same image, but on a global scale. And this really offers a great comparison and contrast for not only the South China Sea, but East Asia and the activities. For illustrative purposes, I've placed an image of a fishing vessel. I think this is a squid boat that has nighttime illumination, drawing fish or squid to the surface. And in the center of the screen, you can see how that might look at nighttime, those images being detected. And that information can be correlated with automated identification system or transponders from the vessels to see if any vessel is fishing illegally or not transponding or correlated with a particular light. And again, this is provided just for representational purposes only, but it's great information. This information was derived from the Earth Observation Group. I have their website at the bottom. Recommend going to that site if you want to learn a little bit more about the nighttime observation. Next slide, please. So in addition to fisheries, there are energy resources. For the energy resources, the U.S. Energy Information Agency estimates that the South China Sea holds about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil, improved and probable reserves, most of which lie along the margins of the South China Sea, rather than under the disputed islets and reefs. The U.S. Geological Survey in 2012 estimated that there could be another 160 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 12 billion barrels of oil undiscovered in the South China Sea. This depiction here, courtesy of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, depicts the different tracks for energy exploration and development. In the green, you can see Vietnam, in the blue, China, red for Philippines, purple for Malaysia. So in addition to the fisheries, you can see the significance of the oil and energy exploration. Next slide, please. The South China Sea is a major trade route for crude oil. And in 2016, more than 30% of the global maritime crude oil trade, or about 15 million barrels per day, passed through the South China Sea. More than 90% of crude oil volumes flowing through the South China Sea in 2016 transited the Strait of Malacca, the shortest sea route between suppliers in Africa and the Persian Gulf and markets in Asia. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development estimated that roughly 60% of maritime trade passes through Asia, with the South China Sea carrying an estimated 1/3 of global shipping, valued at an estimated $3.4 trillion in 2016. Next slide, please. So the significance of the South China Sea is indisputable. What is in dispute, however, are the unresolved maritime boundaries for the South China Sea claimant states. Maritime boundaries that are recognized and agreed upon are the basis for unilateral and multilateral governance of the maritime domain. These disputes serve as the backdrop for insecurity in Southeast Asia, a region that will arguably be the epicenter of geopolitical and geostrategic shifts for the next 2 decades. Depicted on this slide, you will see an example of how the United Nations and the International Rules-Based Order looks at maritime boundaries. Whereas you have the high seas up to 200 miles, you had the exclusive economic zone, the contiguous zone, and a territorial sea. These are all tethered to a baseline for a particular nation or land. That is, each one of these sections have different rules and responsibilities associated with them. And this is what's being contested. Next to this, you see a rough depiction of the South China Sea with the maritime claims of the different states. And if it looks confusing, you're correct, it is confusing. There are a lot of unresolved maritime disputes in the region, not simply between China and other countries, but also between Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, etc. I also wanted to provide a quote from Ian Urbina, who recently wrote The Outlaw Ocean, which is an excellent book on a topic which is most people are unfamiliar with, and it pertains to the nefarious activities that occur out on the oceans. And one of the key takeaways was a quote, and if I may, he writes, "For all its breathtaking beauty, the ocean is also a dystopian place, home to dark inhumanities, the rule of law, often so solid on land, bolstered and clarified by centuries of careful wordsmithing, hard-fought jurisdictional lines, and robust enforcement regimes, is fluid at sea, if it's to be found at all. It is difficult to govern a maritime domain when there are clear and agreed upon boundaries. It is nearly impossible to govern it when there are boundary disputes, especially in an economically vibrant area like the South China Sea." Next slide, please. So I want to take a few moments to talk about the People's Republic of China footprint. The island ownership and maritime boundaries have always been an issue to a lesser or greater degree in the South China Sea. Yet it became significant in 2009 when China published its infamous 9-dash line. In essence, claiming all of the South China Sea as China's territory. In the past decade, China has worked to not only legitimize its claim, but to also establish a destabilizing military and law enforcement presence. Actions include building artificial islands and expanding runways to handle surveillance aircraft, and establishing port facilities to sustain maritime militias. I offer a few slides to help illustrate the significance of this presence. The information is derived from the Center for Strategic and International Studies China Power Series and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which I highly encourage you to visit for more in-depth analysis and excellent visual products on not only the South China Sea, but also East Asia and the Pacific. In this slide, you will see a map which depicts the 9-dash line, and you can see from the east, it extends from Taiwan, south along the Philippines, culminating in the southwest near the Natuna Islands of Indonesia, and then back up around the border with Vietnam. Next to this, and this is important to point out, China does not occupy every island feature in the South China Sea. In this depiction, you can see in green, those are locations where Vietnam has entities or occupies the islands. In red would be the Philippines. You can see China in blue, Malaysia in purple, and then Pratas Island up in the northeast for Taiwan. So again, it's not just between China and the other countries. All the countries have claims that have yet to be resolved. But China has taken action which is more provocative for a long-term strategic presence. Next slide, please. I'll point out a few here. Again, you can see the Chinese fishing vessels, the fishing fleets. Many of these loiter in the region. It's interesting to note that there are not enough fish to sustain the size of their fishing fleets. Most of these vessels go into disputed territories and they stay there and they push out, whether it's Philippines, Vietnam, or other fisher folk, just to maintain a Chinese presence. They also have a surveillance and reconnaissance role as well to monitor what's happening in the region. Here you will see also a depiction of where Woody Island, Subi Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, and Mischief Reef, where China has a presence, and they're also building airfields. And I'll talk about the significance of these in a moment. But in the corner, you can also see this little orange dotted line. This depicts AIS, Automated Identification System, of Chinese vessels, fishing vessels, that are going directly from China to the Spratly Islands. From this, you can discern that there's not a lot of fishing going on. They are just simply going to and from in a straight line to the area. And again, to maintain a presence, to demonstrate China's dominion over these islands. Next slide, please. So what's the significance? Well, from an intelligence standpoint, this gives you an idea of the radar coverage from using Woody Island, Subi Reef, Mischief, and Fiery Cross Reefs. Next slide, please. If you want to expand that, looking at surveillance aircraft, for example, the KJ-500, this gives you a sense of what the coverage would be. Next slide, please. And taking it even further, if you're looking at operational activities, the employment of weapons, this gives you a much more, a better visualization of what China's strength looks like in the region. More so than anyone else who occupies island, China has most certainly militarized these to maintain dominance in the South China Sea. Next slide, please. But in the same light that you cannot discuss the South China Sea without mentioning China, you also must look at ASEAN. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is leading international efforts to stabilize the South China Sea. In 2019, the 10 members of ASEAN, 5 of whom border the South China Sea, released their outlook on the Indo-Pacific, articulating the opportunities and challenges for the region. Although the outlook does not call out specific countries, the underlying message is that the great power competition in Southeast Asia, and more specifically the South China Sea, is creating patterns of behavior that lead to instability. These patterns involve provocative actions, such as increased militarization by the PRC, and freedom of navigation operations by the United States and other nations. However, ASEAN believes that if behaviors and activities in the maritime domain were more transparent, then the parties in the region would find it easier to develop trust and confidence, mitigating factors that lead to instability. At this point, I want to revisit my initial comments regarding the economic vitality of the South China Sea. For ASEAN member states, the more immediate and tangible day-to-day threats relate to illegal fishing, piracy, trafficking in persons, terrorism, maritime pollution, and safety of maritime commerce. Unlike NATO or the European Union, ASEAN works from consensus, with a focus to manage and alleviate mistrust within and among members, most of whom have historic religious, ethnic, economic, and governance differences. Therefore, trust building is at the core of any ASEAN-led maritime security architecture for the South China Sea. Also, ASEAN as an institution is not designed to handle classified or intelligence information, but there are some intelligence-related efforts, such as the RIs initiative within the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, whereby military leaders share information on regional terrorism. There is also the ASEAN Direct Communication Infrastructure, designed for defense ministers to contact each other directly in order to de-escalate a crisis at sea. These are practical measures, but they are limited to the most senior officials within the ASEAN defense mechanisms. Next slide, please. So this prompts the question, how can intelligence and maritime domain awareness be employed to enhance maritime security in the South China Sea? To answer this, first, it is important to explain the relationship of maritime domain awareness to intelligence. There are various definitions of intelligence, but for the purpose of this discussion, the Office of Director of National Intelligence definition will be used, in that intelligence is information that involves threats to a nation, its people, property, or interests. I would add that intelligence is more specifically directed toward activities that obtain and exploit information that an adversary attempts to conceal. Maritime domain awareness, however, is defined by the Department of Homeland Security and the International Maritime Organization as the effective understanding of anything associated with the maritime domain that could impact the security, safety, economy, or environment. In essence, maritime domain awareness is the foundation for the international maritime rules-based order. Information and intelligence is the foundation for multilateral policymaking and a stimulus for government action. Next slide, please. So maritime domain awareness is often used as a synonymous term for maritime intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activities, or ISR. ISR certainly contributes to broader maritime domain awareness, but MDA involves more stakeholders than a Navy or a maritime law enforcement agency. MDA benefits national and multinational efforts to understand the marine environment and exert governance over the maritime domain. Sometimes MDA will involve sensitive intelligence activities directed towards threat actors, such as terrorist elements or criminal syndicates. But more often than not, MDA involves transparent actions designed to promote safety and security. So, MDA and intelligence are tethered as instruments for security and governance in the South China Sea. Both are essential components of a regional security and economic architecture. However, MDA information sharing can be employed more broadly across multiple pillars in order to address issues such as illegal fishing, maritime pollution, marine debris, and maritime connectivity, as well as smuggling and trafficking and boundary delimitation negotiations. In these areas, MDA supports the ASEAN principles of openness and transparency, inclusivity, and a maritime rules-based order that reinforces good governance and international law. Specifically, the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. More specifically, MDA information is foundational for peace and stability because it provides valid data that advances the resolution of maritime disputes that have the potential for open conflict. MDA promotes maritime safety, it counters the exploitation of maritime resources, and it identifies instances of marine pollution. Next slide, please. So moving forward, I want to take a moment to talk about emerging trends in maritime domain awareness tools. As I previously mentioned, intelligence and maritime domain awareness should and can focus on activities that involve maritime governance, as well as activities that help to peacefully resolve disputes. For example, the use of geospatial information to accurately identify, define, and measure land features that are used as a baseline for maritime boundaries can contribute to informing all parties involved in maritime delimitation negotiations. MDA information can also advance safety and security measures by using commercially available data from uncrewed autonomous systems and space-based platforms for vessel tracking and monitoring with the intent to prevent criminal and terrorist use of the maritime domain and to promote and protect fisheries and maritime commerce. There are also multilateral cooperation efforts outside of ASEAN that are advancing maritime domain awareness and intelligence sharing. Investigative tools such as link analysis software can address transnational crimes, including trafficking in persons or illicit drugs, sea piracy, and armed robbery against ships at sea. For the environment, tools will be employed to manage and monitor marine resources and respond to marine pollution. But I believe the most impressive step forward for intelligence and maritime domain awareness in the South China Sea is the establishment of maritime data fusion centers that serve as a single point of contact. These centers generally report to the highest levels of government. They are interagency, and they are able to leverage whole of government authorities and tools. So I know that this was a lot of information to absorb. So at this point, I will pause and turn it back over to Dr. Ard for any questions and comments. Michael, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for that very informative presentation. There's certainly a lot to talk about, and everybody, please post your questions in the Q&A, or you can use the chat if that's easier for you, and we'll be taking questions shortly. Chris, a few things I'd like to ask about. One is, and it kind of follows off on your last point about the fusion centers. It struck me from one of the points you were making about maritime domain awareness, which is much broader than simply intelligence. It's now, but what is the role that non-governmental organizations are playing or can play in increasing our understanding of maritime domain awareness in the South China Sea?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And NGOs, the non-government organizations, are certainly playing a role in a variety of ways. You have some entities like Global Fishing Watch, which are looking at illegal fishing globally using technology, AIS, and they are sharing that data with some of these fusion centers and other entities that can take action. They're also working with governments in the region to obtain some of the data. For example, Indonesia shares their data with Global Fishing Watch to help counter illegal fishing. These NGOs can bring in scientists, they can bring in experts who can focus entirely on a particular problem. But it's not just for tracking vessels. You also have NGOs that are looking at human trafficking and labor violations, much of which occurs in the fishing realm. So they will look at the financials, they will look at the companies, they will see if a vessel has changed its name from the good ship Lollipop 1 to the good ship Lollipop 2, just to get away from some of the potential criminal violations. So we have a lot of NGOs with talented people that are good-hearted looking at these issues. The challenge historically has been the data. They didn't have access to the information. And much of the information was within the intelligence community because of the platforms, of the sources and the mechanisms that were used. Very expensive to deploy. You needed sophisticated people that were trustworthy to monitor them. But that's all changed. Much of this is now commercially available, it's publicly available, and we're seeing how the private sector and NGOs are using it. Switching a little bit, looking at Ukraine, you can see how this is occurring in Ukraine with the imagery that's being used to find mass graves. Important, absolutely. But if you are relying on your intelligence community to do this, you're only going to have a few analysts, and they're going to have to prioritize what they're focused on. So by bringing in the NGOs and the private sector, you can provide much more information using data sources that are the same, or in some cases even better than what an intelligence community might use, that will benefit a whole of government, not just a Navy, not just a Coast Guard, but a fisheries department, labor department, the economic aspects. So yeah, there's a tremendous role for the private sector when it comes to MDA.
How about ASEAN itself? It's not NATO. It's a different type of organization. What is, would you say, the climate or the aptitude for sharing among the ASEAN nations when it comes to things like intelligence?
Oh, yeah. So when we talk ASEAN, we're going to talk ASEAN as the institution with all 10 countries. Mm-hmm. And then we can talk ASEAN, the member countries working within and amongst themselves. Generally, when it comes to intelligence sharing, things that are related to terrorism, criminal activities, things of that nature, that will not go through ASEAN. Those will be bilateral or minilateral relationships within and among the countries. It's important to note that many countries, not just in Southeast Asia, but around the world, they are prohibited from sharing information not only with other countries, but with other entities within their own government. There's usually budgetary issues associated with it. Sometimes there's rules that are associated. Realize in many places, intelligence agencies correspond with human rights violations in the past. So other agencies in those governments don't necessarily want to work with them. So we have this whole cultural factor that you've got to look at. But in general, on matters of terrorism specifically, you will see governments sort of working with each other. When it comes to ASEAN as an institution, it's much more of a macro perspective. We're looking at broader trends and trying to establish mechanisms by which dialogue can occur. So since we're talking about terrorism, I'll use that as an example. You will find that within ASEAN, they have different mechanisms addressing terrorism. Under the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting and ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting plus, they have a terrorism expert working group where they will discuss trends in terrorism. They will do exercises. Many of this happens to deal with maritime issues, but you also find it within the ASEAN Regional Forum. They deal with maritime security as well, but that has to do a lot more with returning foreign fighters. How do you prevent disenfranchised communities from leaning towards more extremist views? So it's a broad effort, but ASEAN as an institution is consensus based. So they all agree on it, which gives a lot of top cover for individual politicians and bureaucrats within our country to say, this isn't my opinion, this is what ASEAN has agreed on, and our senior leadership has already agreed on this as well. So it allows them to kind of punch above their weight in many cases.
Let me get to our questions in our Q&A in the chat. Thank you for these questions, everybody. One question here, let me see if I can rephrase this a bit. The role of technical intelligence or technical collection as part of maritime domain awareness. What do you see? Is this principally a technical collection challenge, or are there other ends that we can be bringing to bear on this more effectively?
I often find that technical issues are a challenge, but the bigger challenge is more policy and information related. It's relatively easy to find a tool or a technical solution for a problem, but collecting that information or exploiting what data is derived from that technical solution, if it goes and just resides in some place and never goes to a stakeholder who can take action on it, that's the problem. And so a lot of what MDA does isn't so much the collection of the information, it's how do you take that information and get it to a key enabler, whether it's a political stakeholder to kind of establish a new policy or regulation, whether it's to a law enforcement or regulatory agency who has the authority to take action. That's really the challenge for MDA. And speaking of the technical means, technology costs money. Not a lot of agencies have money to afford sophisticated technologies. So previously I mentioned these fusion centers. One of the beauty of the fusion centers is because they're whole of government, you may have a Navy which has a certain capability or a Coast Guard, but the information is going to support a fisheries agency who could not afford that technology. By having these fusion centers, it's much easier for them to share the data and kind of task those technical capabilities to go out and collect in areas that maybe a Navy wasn't aware was an issue before, or that a Coast Guard wasn't aware that there was a gap. So yeah, I see technicality is always a problem. It's always costs money, but the bigger issue is the interagency and the information sharing from a policy standpoint.
Let me ask about the fusion center for a second. How many countries have a fusion center, and do they have representatives from other ASEAN countries in the centers? Okay,
so there are fusion centers, and many of them have existed for a while, but not in a current context. So you have in the Philippines, the Philippine National Coast Watch Center. And I hope I don't mess up some of these abbreviations. It's been a while. The Brunei National Maritime Center. I think I got that wrong. Indonesia has established their center. Thailand has the Thai Maritime Enforcement Command Center. Singapore has their own information fusion center, which the Singapore Center is actually more of the multilateral one, where you will have the United States Navy's present there. You'll see China there. You will see other countries present. The Singapore Fusion Center, however, focuses more on the Strait of Malacca and commercial shipping, really focused on preventing piracy and keeping piracy kind of tapped down in the region. Not a lot for the South China Sea, not a lot for the fisheries, but speaking of NGOs, you do have institutions such as RECAP, the regional, oh gosh, I'm gonna screw this up here. Cooperative Agreement Against Piracy and Armed Robbery of Ships in Asia. But it's RECAP, based in Singapore. They do in-depth analysis on piracy in not only in Singapore, but throughout the entire region, so that there's a better understanding and context of what's happening. Otherwise, what would happen is you'll end up having insurance rates go through the roof of every vessel going through the region without having the context of, was this really a piracy incident or was it an inside job that was, touted as piracy? So RECAP does a tremendous job doing the analysis and kind of providing context for it. But yeah, each of the countries in the region are developing a fusion center. I think Vietnam's in the process, Malaysia is in the process, Cambodia as well. Myanmar, I'm not quite sure of the status for Myanmar. But the importance of them is it allows each other fusion center a single point of contact to otherwise, they would have 10 agencies in one government, 10 agencies in another government, all trying to communicate with each other. These single points of contact are critical for sharing information and for collaboration on MDA.
What role, this is another question from the audience, is the U.S. Coast Guard playing perhaps in a liaison function with some of the ASEAN countries, and should it be doing more?
So the U.S. Coast Guard is expanding its presence. One thing that you're going to see is more and more deployments of cutters to the region. There's also the Southeast Asia Maritime Law Enforcement Initiative, where the U.S. Coast Guard works with some of the countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, for example, to kind of do capacity building, whether it's MDA information sharing, whether it's best practices on shipboarding, whether it's trends in drugs. So that is a positive trend. Also, during the most recent ASEAN-US summit, President Biden announced that there's going to be a U.S. Coast Guard attaché assigned to ASEAN to kind of help advance some of these initiatives moving forward. So yeah, the U.S. Coast Guard actually has a significant role in Southeast Asia, and I look forward and I hope that it's only going to increase, because many of the navies in Southeast Asia are actually more closely aligned with Coast Guards than they are navies. And so their authorities and their responsibilities are closely aligned with what the U.S. Coast Guard does. So if the U.S. Navy shows up with an aircraft carrier and, kind of a fleet, it's sort of a mismatch in, the priorities for the U.S. versus the priority for the partner. The partners are concerned about drugs. They're concerned about terrorism. They're concerned about other things that the U.S. Coast Guard deals with on an everyday pollution, for example. Navy doesn't necessarily deal with pollution to the extent that Coast Guard does. So yeah, the Coast Guard has a robust role in Southeast Asia, particularly from MDA standpoint.
What do you think, and another question is, the U.S. can be doing better to help in encouraging information sharing?
Oh, I would like to say we just continue doing sort of what we're doing. Try not to allow countries to pick a side. It's either us or China or this. Keep in mind that the U.S. generally outpaces everyone, both financially and with resources. We may be talking to a counterpart and it's one person that the U.S. would have 5 people on that portfolio. So the scale of our ability to contribute is something that we need to be cognizant of. But the biggest thing I think we can contribute is on the private sector side, more space technology, autonomous technology, all of these things that we see evolving every day, bring more of that to the region, set up offices there, hire locals from the region who are brilliant, well-educated, They understand technology probably better than many Americans. Establish a presence in the region for your products, for your tools, for your technology. And then those will blend in and kind of complement the MDA efforts of the particular countries. And again, it may not be for vessel tracking. It could be to counter marine debris and plastics, which is another big problem. So I think that's what the U.S. should do is kind of more private sector engagements, particularly on the science and technology side.
One thing, a question from our audience about control over the South China Sea. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, that this is really, in some ways, the tragedy of the commons, right? I mean, there's really nobody in control. And this is one of the reasons why fishing has depleted so much in the region. But one question I had related to this, I hope this helps our listener, is, we've been dealing with this issue now for a number of years. I don't know when it exactly started where conscience was raised about it, but have the neighboring countries in the South China Sea gotten better at the governance question in the area, if you get my meaning? Are they starting to figure out better ways of encouraging legal behavior? Or
yeah. So I'll offer a couple of examples. You see the establishment of coast guards in the region. For many countries, the coast guards were kind of a law enforcement entity, or it fell underneath the Navy. Now we see in Indonesia, they have established Bakama, their own coast guard. Malaysia has done the same thing. You're seeing the coast guards also get more resources and more influence within the government. So they don't necessarily fall into the shadow of the Navy anymore. They are stepping out on their own. And the reason why is because they have authorities and there's a demand, there's a need to have more governance of your own maritime territory. So yeah, they are most certainly stepping up. And not only are they stepping up, they're collaborating with each other. They are working with each other, which is something that the navies will collaborate on the high seas. Navies will collaborate, kind of with joint exercises. But coast guards, there's a hard boundary. On this side is where my authorities exist, and on this side of the boundary is where it ends. But they can share information and best practices with each other. So I see a lot of capacity building happening in the South China Sea, within and amongst the coast guards, and more trust and confidence. The United Nations is doing a great job at this, the Office of Drugs and Crime program, particularly in the Sulu and Celebes Seas, bringing together the leaders of these different coast guards twice a year to come and talk about issues and how to address terrorism, how to address crime, to share information on what's happening, to come up with terms of reference on how they can share information with each other. So yeah, I think there's tremendous movement in the region for the countries to better understand this. And I'll also add on, Michael, that there's also a genuine interest to resolve the maritime disputes within and amongst each other. But when you've got a country like Indonesia, where you have thousands of islands, some of which are not even named yet, or the same thing in the Philippines, no one has ever mapped these out. It's not as easy as saying, well, this is our island, so we're going to take a long tape measure and go out 200 nautical miles. There's science that determines, what a baseline is, and it's not just go out here. You have to do this over years to determine what your baselines are and are not. They are working together with this. So no one is giving up their sovereignty, but there's also a desire to resolve these disputes diplomatically, but they're going to do it with data. And they're going to do it with agreed upon data. And that's where I think MDA plays a crucial role in the South China Sea.
Yeah. Riley asked a question. I'm going to try to rephrase it because I think it, in some ways, it captures a little bit of the gist of your presentation. We have, U.S. has committed some resources, freedom of navigation operations, particularly to try to emphasize rule of the sea in the area, right? And but what about our commitment to that area? Is it sufficient? And I mean, is this really on a trajectory to become that is the South China Sea a Chinese lake?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a loaded question, but I think I can answer it because I'm
Okay.
no longer in government and
Right.
I can give my opinion. Just within the past few weeks, there's been positive momentum. We've announced an ambassador. We have an ambassador going to the U.S. mission to ASEAN. We haven't had somebody there for the past 5 years. We have ambassadors in Thailand, in the Philippines. So our diplomatic presence is becoming a bit more stable, where it has not for the past few years. I think the U.S. has also learned kind of the limits of what we can do. I know earlier I mentioned freedom of navigation operations. And when I mentioned it as kind of destabilizing, I intended that from the perspective of some of the ASEAN nations. They see it as destabilizing.
Mhm.
I see it as an important role, but it shouldn't be the only, it's to use, we're in football season, so maybe to use a bad metaphor, freedom of navigation operations are like your extra points or your field goals. They score points, but they're not going to score touchdowns. We have to do other things that are not necessarily military, but more on the diplomatic and on the development side. And again, I'm going to go back to the science and technology. That's where the U.S. can really gain influence in Southeast Asia, particularly for an MDA. There is obviously a role for the military, and the U.S. military does play a stable. I mean, quite frankly, if it wasn't for the U.S. Navy, I think it would be a Chinese lake now, because nobody's going to go to war with China on this. So the U.S. presence, those of other countries in the region, stepping up with their freedom of navigation operations, their activities, demonstrate that, the rule of law means something, and you just can't go in and establish something and think that it's a foregone conclusion. There will be consequences. And China's learning that. And some would argue that they were somewhat ham-fisted in their approach to the South China Sea. And so still to be determined, but I do agree with the ASEAN approach of transparency, discussion, keeps things from becoming an open conflict. Just because you're not going to war with China doesn't mean that you acknowledge and agree with what they've done. And so you can push back in other ways.
Right. I mean, largely, in some ways, it's been encouraging, I would say, that this has really been an effort of coast guards and fishing fleets and not navies clashing. But that leads me to another question: how do you foresee, for example, the expansion of Chinese naval activity proper in the region, including, for example, establishing permanent bases in that littoral area?
Yeah. It's it is what it is. I don't think, going back to the economics of it alone, there's a reason why there's so much fishing activity that occurs in East Asia and South China Sea, because you have to feed 1 billion people in China. There's a reason why there's a demand for oil and gas, because China has exploited all of its own. It needs to have oil and gas moving forward. There's a legitimate reason. China legitimately believes that it is their territory and they are willing to defend it. I don't know what the off-ramp is for this, other than to continue to look at the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which clearly articulates territorial boundaries, and to continue to kind of have these negotiations and discussions. But the way things are now, particularly with Xi in power and kind of the warrior wolf diplomacy, I don't see an off-ramp in the near future. What I do see is some very pragmatic approaches from both the military and from the diplomats throughout the region to stabilize, not let it get any worse, not necessarily to accept the status quo, but to buy time. And for them to also become a bit more sophisticated on how to address maritime related challenges.
A lot of what we've been talking about, I'm rephrasing another question from Chris, who asked about, okay, so what about issues that everybody can get behind? Not just ASEAN countries, but China too, right? So there's certain issues that are going on in the South China Sea, for example, smuggling, piracy, things like that, that perhaps there could be more areas of cooperation. Do you see that? And maybe this is a way of reinforcing the idea of respecting the rule of law.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do see this is what ASEAN is very good at, finding areas where there can be agreements. For example, safety of life at sea. Nobody wants people to drown at sea. Nobody wants vessels at sea that are not seaworthy. You want to have the capacity to go out and to respond to a vessel that is sinking, or whether it's a ferry or something else. Those are areas where there can be agreement. Pollution. Nobody wants an oil spill in the Strait of Malacca or the South China Sea. How can you collaborate? Let's say if a vessel is damaged in somebody's waters, but the spill goes into somebody else's waters. How do you respond to that? What are the rules? What are the authorities? So there's a lot of areas for cooperation in the region. And I do see that occurring. Some of it's slow, some of it happens really quickly. So on that note, we can just look at COVID-19. Pandemics have always been an issue for the region, particularly after SARS. But it wasn't until COVID-19 that it really became a front burner issue. So some of the policies that were being developed and issues became a front burner priority, but it had been worked on for a decade prior. It just so happened that it took COVID-19 for it to become implemented. But this also relates to the maritime realm. All of a sudden, you have seafarers who are stuck at sea for months after their contracts have ended. Nobody's going to let them into the ports. They can't go from this place. They can't get refueled. There's all of these challenges that nobody anticipated because of COVID-19 that affected the maritime domain. And this forced kind of the Coast Guards and the Navies and the port officials to sort of look at, hey, how can we collaborate and share information on this vessel to get these crew members off and get these other crew members on, even though there's a lockdown. Again, society has a way of kind of popping up with problems that nobody really anticipated. But COVID is an example of something where they had been working on an issue for years. And then once it happened, it became a priority. And I think the same thing will happen in the maritime realm. They're going to continue to focus to a lesser or greater degree on issues like pollution, marine debris and plastic, vessel trafficking, human labor. But when something becomes a crisis, then it's going to really escalate up to the forefront. But it'll be a multilateral collaborative approach, which includes China.
And I think that gets to your question on human rights a bit, in terms of information sharing in the area on that. Also, we have another question too about, you mentioned AIS and its use on ships. Chris, is this standard throughout the region?
It should be. So AIS is not a panacea. And kind of going back to the 1990s, we can look at the Exxon Valdez and we can see other incidents where activities occurred, accidents that should have been prevented and would have been prevented had the technology been implemented. And that's what AIS was. It's a safety and navigation. It's to keep two ships from bumping into each other during the fog or running aground in the fog. But the technology has so many more applications. And as the cost has come down, you can put it on other vessels. And without going into all the details of it, certain vessels are required to have AIS, other vessels are not. So sometimes it's encouraged. A country can encourage vessels to have or require AIS on certain vessels. So the rules are different. And even if it's on there, sometimes it's technology. Sometimes they think it's transmitting, but it's not being received, or there's no terrestrial receiver for it. So you're really only getting, and I'm going to throw a ballpark figure, 50% accurate picture of actually what's happening using AIS. But I do want to say that we're about to see, I think, a complete change in this. So Starlink going up, the internet available anywhere. We're going to start to see opportunities where every vessel can be tracked from a cell phone, if you can. So instead of having a $1,000 system on a fishing vessel, which has really narrow margins of profit, now you can have something the size of your hand, which is being detected from Elon Musk, and that's being brought into some NGO. And all of a sudden, we have a much bigger picture of the maritime domain. And that, Michael, brings me to another issue, which is going to be big data. Big data is actually the fundamental problem for the maritime domain. How do you take all of this information, all of these data points, and make sense of it? And it's going to get better to the point where it's going to be easier to track vessels and monitor. It's going to get worse to the extent that you're going to have to figure out how to manage and process and protect that information.
maybe that's where more of a role of the private sector that we see in this.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's one area which I think, one of the themes that we've been touching on in this series has been the role of the private sector, growing role of the private sector in intelligence, and we expect that to continue. I think, folks, that I believe we've covered well your questions. If I didn't ask it directly, I felt like Chris had answered it in the presentation. If you would like to see this presentation on our YouTube channel, please look it up by JHU at AAP YouTube. You can put that in your search engine and you'll find it. Just click on videos. We'll have the link up in a day or two. We also we post the link to these presentations on our LinkedIn pages, so you can find it there as well. Chris, we thank you very much for this presentation today. Very informative, very nuanced. I think we have a better understanding of the region, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
Great. I look forward to it. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. And everybody, keep an eye out for our next program on inside intelligence. And thanks for being with us today.